Welcome back, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal on behalf of Bruce Alderman and the Integral Stage and the entire overlapping transformational set of communities out front so they don't have to be. And today I'm bringing you another installment of our acclaimed author series. We're joined today by ambiguously controversial post-guru guru Andrew Cohen to discuss his new book, When Shadow Meets the Bodhisattva Ideal, which chronicles the collapse of his former organization devoted to collective evolutionary enlightenment, his subsequent struggle to become more nuanced and more humane, as well as his pondering about how classical mechanisms of transcendence, such as the function of the guru transmitter, can adapt productively to more complex individuals and cultures without being carelessly discarded due to its many admitted dangers and flaws. And you know, folks, the Integral Stage is a non-judgmental access platform. It doesn't believe that discussion constitutes endorsement, but nonetheless, from time to time, you will hear me recommend something for a specific reason. And I recommend this book for anyone who takes seriously the problems and possibilities of the future of spirituality. I happen to be one of those people, so I enjoyed this book immensely. Whatever you might feel or think about Andrew and his past behavior and his current state or any of that stuff, I found this book to be unusual among the autobiographies of consciousness mutants and spot on in terms of the problems and the cul-de-sacs that he discovers in this volume. I think it does a really good and personal job of mapping the edge of what we know about the dynamics of interpersonal transmission, integral spirituality, and the human complexity of people with unusual experiences of consciousness. So if that's some of the stuff you're into, this book is definitely worth a read. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Layman. That was a beautiful description of the book. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just praised it a little. And I'll tell you, when I mention it to people, they listen to the reasons why I appreciate this book. And then they ask me something like, yes, but is he serious? Has he really changed? And there's obviously an interesting constellation of reasons why folks have that as an initial attitude. But I'm curious how it makes you feel to be constantly doubted and treated with suspicion by people who are smart, spiritually inclined, reasonably mature humans. What's it like for your heart to face that kind of mistrust all the time?
It's challenging. I'm human. It's challenging. It's challenging, but it's nothing new. A lot of people have treated me with suspicion and those kind of questions ever since the first day I started teaching in Rishikesh in 1986. So I'm used to it. I'm so used to it now that I can't imagine being seen otherwise, to be honest.
You know, writing a book like this is an act of communication, and it's also a way to consolidate and organize your insights and a way of telling a story about yourself, updating the human autobiography and partly recreating who you are to face the next chapter of your life. I'm curious about what it's like for you to write a book like this. How do you experience the art of inventing and reinventing your life? Because any autobiography is partly recording and it's also partly creating.
Well, I think that, I mean, the biggest revelation for me was that I had a powerful awakening when I met my guru in 1986, and I was having a powerful effect on people right away. And I was praised left and right by my students and by my teacher. And I started to think that I had no shadow. This was my shadow. Andrew's main shadow was that he believed in all his delusion that he had no shadow. I believed that I was a pure being and a pure soul. And this set me up for problems much later on. And so I think being able to be honest about that and transparent about that has helped me to grow quite a bit as a human being and also as a teacher. I thought I had to see myself as being more perfect than I actually am, to be able to be the kind of teacher that I believe that I am. And I realized that wasn't necessarily the case at all. And I've come to understand that this is one of the main messages of the book, and this is something that this point that Jeffrey Kripal makes, is that enlightenment, when enlightenment is deep and profound, that enlightenment, the experience of gnosis, doesn't have anything necessarily to do with moral purity or moral perfection. And I think there's been a presumption for millennia that the attainment of gnosis or the agreed upon attainment of gnosis automatically implies a state of moral purity or moral perfection. And I think what happened in the postmodern era when so many great realizers came to the West, this truth couldn't remain hidden behind the postmodern gaze. The postmodern gaze was so powerful and so profound that we started seeing that so many great realizers were flawed human beings, and sometimes seriously flawed human beings. At the same time, they obviously had great realization and the power to affect a profound transformation in so many people. So a lot of people have been trying to make sense out of this for a long time. And I'm hoping that the realization, one of the things I'm fond of saying that is it's possible to experience perfection, but it's not possible to be perfection. Because I want to be able to inspire people, once again, to believe that enlightenment is actually real, because I feel that because of the failures of so many teachers, and I think, unfortunately, including myself, a lot of people have given up on the hope that enlightenment is possible for them, or even if it is, it ultimately means anything. And I continue to find, as I teach more vigorously, that enlightenment is as profound and miraculous and as life-changing as it always has been. And I only wish more people would become interested in the possibility of awakening themselves, because it's changed my life beyond recognition, and it's been my salvation every day, and it continues to be. And it is so glorious, miraculous, and profound, and life-affirming. It's becomes a metaphysical source of absolute hope and deep conviction in the inherent positivity of life and the experiment of life in the universe. And I think, especially today, with all the complexity that we're facing in the world system, that having deep and unconditional faith in the perfection and the miracle of the creative process is important for us to, as a source of solace in these challenging times. But ultimately, I'm trying to reinvigorate the meaning and significance of enlightenment in the 21st century.
So part of that seems to me to involve a shift in how we think about the persona, right? It seems like in older cultures, it was comfortable for people to conflate an individual with their persona. So you could be enlightened and also have an enlightened personality character to put forward to people. But in more complex societies, there's a lot more justified skepticism around the persona. I'm not sure if I'm a unique individual, maybe I'm a plurality. I don't know how much is unconscious or conscious, or right. There's a growth into a broader, more fluid sense of what it means to be a human character. And that can create some conflicts with this traditional mode of asserting something, even if that something is the deep existential trust of being from the precision of a persona. So how do you, going forward into a deeper 21st century enlightenment, how does a guru transmitter tease their function apart from the social role, from the identity of being a guru transmitter?
Well, I think it's by being very clear about the distinction between the transmission of enlightened awareness and the rare capacity to actually transmit consciousness to others, and being very clear about the fact that we're all the perfect human beings. We're all works in progress, including the so-called enlightened one. And my guru once said to a close friend of mine, the great H.W.L. Punju once said to a friend of mine when they were alone together, he said, remember, when referring to himself, not to mistake the man for the master. And I think as part of our evolving understanding of the significance of this kind of transformation, that there's a big distinction between the ongoing evolution of our humanity and the challenging business of the ongoing purification of our complex and contradictory natures being humans, and the capacity to know the ultimate truth about the nature of reality and to be able to experience it and transmit it to others, and be very careful not to automatically conflate the two, not to conflate the two. It's funny because when I teach now, when I'm at my best, I can still transmit or convey a profound sense of beauty and wholeness and integration. But that beauty and wholeness and integration is not the totality of who I am as a person. I'm still a flawed human being, full of contradictions and paradoxes like everybody else. But I can, when I'm in my most awakened state, appear to be far more integrated and than I actually am. But that's an expression of the enlightened state itself. It's more an expression of the enlightened state itself and less to do with me personally.
One of the really engaging parts of this narrative is the story of you being in a situation of certain kinds of privilege for many years, social
Absolutely.
privilege in terms of being one who is served as the master of a community, but also
Yes.
an internal privilege of being in touch with this deep existential sense of security and motivation. And as you go through this book, you go through a period where you seem to lose connection with that, lose some trust in that you have to regain. What did going through that period of disconnect teach you or help you to understand about the vulnerability of other people who don't have the privilege of having spent a lot of their life in that condition of consciousness?
It was a huge wake-up call, because I said I experienced a lot of the desperation and the desolation and the terror that a lot of people, including some of my own students, experience when faced with their own shadow, their own dark side, their own worst fears. And I experienced unbearable suffering for several years, which I felt brought me to my knees in the most important way, I think, because I learned that, because the thing is, because I've been an evolutionary ever since I started teaching, I never understood why the Buddha put so much emphasis on the need to kind of acknowledge suffering, because the suffering is the first noble truth of Buddhism. So I never understood why was he making such a big deal out of suffering, because when you wake up, you stop suffering so much and you realize that life is a glorious, a purely positive event. And then as I began to experience the truth of suffering, I started realizing that I started seeing how much suffering there was in the world all around me, and that suffering is brutal, relentless, and it's one dimension of reality, that it's an inconsolable, a horrible truth about the nature of existence and about the nature of sentient existence. And I feel unless we're actually consciously in touch with that at a level of conscious perception and also emotional sensitivity, no matter how awake we are to enlightened awareness, we're not going to be as fully half as fully awake as we need to be. So it took me a long time and many years to kind of realize this simple but profound truth that suffering is the coming to terms with the truth of suffering is as important as awakening to the truth of enlightened awareness, and we need both. And this is what the Buddha himself was preaching for a long time. It just took me a long time to actually pick it up. So it's helped me to become a lot more human and a lot less arrogant and a lot more sensitive to this dimension of life.
There's a lot of judgment about you in the society. There's a lot of judgment about you from some of your former colleagues and students.
Oh yes, sure.
And that has an effect on you. But how does it strike you when that judgment falls on the people around you? Like, is it heartbreaking to see the people who you love, who've supported you, who still are part of your work, being treated like abused spouses or deluded cultists?
Well, it's painful, but I mean, this has been the story of my life ever since I started teaching in 1986. I think part of it's because I usually awaken a very intense and at times ferocious level of inspiration and commitment in people, which a lot of people find a little bit scary or threatening, because to get that excited and that inspired about the possibilities of human transformation and become that focus on consciousness and the evolution of consciousness as a personal collective goal makes one inherently weird, and you have to be part of a crazy cult to care that much about consciousness in the first place. If you start meditating, your friends will think that's great. You know, ever since you started meditating, you stopped smoking and you seem much more present and you're suffering less, and it's a really good thing. And you say, but the minute somebody gets seriously interested in enlightenment, begins to take it seriously and begins to focus on it with all their heart, their values begin to change, and they begin to wake up at times to a passion for consciousness that in Western society, in postmodern society, it's just perceived as being plain weird and inherently suspicious. Like, what the fuck's the matter with you? Why have you changed so much? Why do you seem to care about something so ephemeral as consciousness? And so I think that I have had that effect on people for a long time, and it's usually been seen as being inherently weird. And of course, in my work as a teacher, I kind of took great risks, and sometimes I pushed people way too hard, which is mainly what I'm become famous for. Unfortunately, not because of a lot of the things that I feel were valuable accomplishments, like focusing on the evolutionary nature of enlightenment and making it part of the public conversation, and doing a lot of work to liberate enlightenment from the merely subjective dimension of the unique individual, and made it possible for consciousness to be an enlightened awareness to be a shared experience. And these, I think, have been and are significant contributions to the evolution of metaphysical spirituality in the West and also in the East. But all I'm known for is taking some of my own desperate attempts to help people awaken. Things that I've taken too far, or things that blew up in my face, I seem to be known principally for that. And I guess focusing on the negative is much easier than focusing on positive. I don't mind being transparent about my mistakes in a more balanced context, but what makes it difficult for me is some things outside the radical context of this kind of bold experiment and just will never make any sense.
Roger Walsh is one of my favorite people, and you describe in the book how you reached out to him for advice in the midst of your transitions. Who else helped you? Who was really useful to you? Who stood by you? Who was your, basic human support system as you were going through this humanizing process?
Well, Roger was beautiful. He gave me some beautiful advice. One of the most important things he said to me was that I was meeting with some of my own students at the time. And he said, it's not a good idea, Andrew, because they'll never be able to. There's too much history involved in this. And in terms of the hierarchical structure that you were working within, this will never work. You need to be meeting with other peers and teachers that can help you. So that was very helpful. The psychotherapist, Jack Engler, helped me a lot because I was being so harshly judged by so many people at the same time. I was feeling very hard to see myself clearly. And Jack was expressing enormous kindness to me, and he was helping me to kind of believe in myself as a human being again, because I wasn't sure who I was anymore. So Jack was very kind to me. Robert Masters helped me a lot. I spent a week working with Robert and his wife in Oregon, and he helped me. He helped me to take a deeper responsibility for my own predicament, because he told me that I'd given up my power, in this case to my own students, and I was utterly lost. He said, unless you take responsibility for yourself, you're never going to get out of this mess. And there was another woman in South America, in Brazil, who was an ayahuasca facilitator, who was a former psychoanalyst, who helped me tremendously also in making clear that I had given up all of my own power. And unless I took it back, I was never going to get out of this mess. And I felt from these people a tremendous amount of kindness and support and encouragement. And of course, the most important person who helped me throughout all this was my very close student and dearest friend and peer in so many ways, Daniela Baumeister, who had been a former student. She'd been a student for 10 years before the crash, 8 years before the crash. And she kept telling me, Anderson, there's nothing wrong with you. I had somehow believed, I had taken on this feeling that a lot of people had, that there was something terribly wrong with me. She kept saying, Andrew, there's nothing wrong with you. And at a certain point, I began to accept the fact that was true. And what was very interesting is as I began to accept my own decency and dignity, as I began to reclaim my own decency and dignity, the enlightened awareness began to return very spontaneously, very naturally. And that really is what changed everything. I was coming back home. Then I suddenly felt like myself again. But I returned to my former enlightened self, so to speak, but much more humbled and much more gentle as a person, less arrogant and less pushy and less full of my own greatness.
It's really interesting to me to think about the relationship between sort of being in one's power and accessing one's greatest gifts, right? So the state, the condition you were in, plus the social situation you were in, plus your guru's advice to never doubt yourself, yes. All that conspired to allow you to be in your power position very strongly. And now you've lost some of that, and then you come back to that power position in a different way. What does all of that tell you about everyone else? Like, what's the relationship between being empowered and being able to access the greatest range of consciousness and capacities that's available to any individual? Like, what does it mean to be in your power such that you can access those things? I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't think I totally can't get the question, but it feels very free.
It's like you had access to a dimension of being that seemed very stable, but it turns out the stability was dependent on a few things that kept you internally enthroned in a way in your position of empowerment. And when you lost that position of empowerment, it was more difficult to connect with your greatest gifts.
But that was self-doubt. That my I'm sorry, I have a throat thing. In order to be able to be a genuine vehicle for enlightened awareness, one has to be doubtless about it. There has to be the kind of duality that doubt generates can't be present. So he was trying to prepare me to accept the role that he knew I was going to be assuming very quickly. The problem with never doubting, but of course on the flip side, never doubting oneself means that I was, when things were happening around me that would indicate that maybe the things I needed to look at and question, I wasn't willing to do it because I wasn't willing to doubt myself. And so that became a big problem. So it was a two-edged sword.
I think there's probably a lot to learn that we can't get into in just this discussion. It's probably lifetimes of analysis of the different ways to not doubt yourself, right? Are you not doubting yourself now in a way that's different than you were not doubting yourself before? And what makes that difference?
Well, no, it's very simple. I don't doubt the enlightenment ever anymore. But in terms of myself as a person, I doubt myself every day.
So it's become more, it's a more targeted doubtlessness.
Yeah, I don't doubt the enlightenment at all. My guru said to me, the most powerful and profound thing he ever said to me was, "Oh, Andrew, I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see." So this has been my touchstone for most of my adult life. But I think that before the crash and before my own, fall from grace, I think I needed to see myself. I mean, I never thought I was perfect, but I think I wanted other people to see me as being perfect. I needed to have other people see me as being perfect. And that died a slow and gruesome death. And I paid a high price for not being willing to give that up. But now I don't have because of everything I've been through, and it's been at a huge cost to me and a lot of other people. I don't feel any need for other people to see me as being perfect. I speak about being flawed all the time when I'm teaching. Not as a way to let myself off the hook, but just to remind everybody that being flawed is part of being human. And enlightenment has nothing to do with being a perfect human being. So just to repeat what I said, that I don't doubt the gift that I've been given by my guru all those years ago. I never doubt that anymore. I never doubt it, but I do doubt myself. I'm questioning myself all the time because, as I said, we're all works in progress, and there's so much of who and what we are as a human level that's so unconscious and below the surface that it's possible for us to be fully conscious of who we are and all our complexity. And we can't be paying more attention to how all this is coming to the surface in our own experience. It's an impossible task. So we're all works in progress, and I sure am myself. But I think that there's something to me very beautiful about being able to, on one hand, stand for and bear witness to the ultimate or absolute nature of reality and of the nature of consciousness itself, while standing courageously and comfortably in the inherent perfection of being human at the same time. It gives a slightly different message to everybody. And I remember when I was speaking to Ken about this about 4 or 5 years ago, he said, "But Andrew, this is going to make everything you're sharing with people so much more attainable," because he said before I was teaching from such a high place that I made people feel that they'd never be able to get there. And now that I can be more honest about my own imperfection of my own humanity and speak about the imperfection of our shared humanity, I can make the goal of enlightenment seem much more actually attainable for so many more people. So it's actually a great gift.
Yeah, I think I agree with that assessment. I think it's important. One of the things that's really important going forward is for these ancient, classical, timeless things to feel more accessible, to feel more permeable.
Absolutely. Indeed.
In the book, you used 3 particular words to describe how some of your most trusted people described you, and those were cruel, cold, and harsh. And this is what it made me curious about. What is it like to search for those qualities in yourself when you don't initially see and feel yourself to be that way? Like, how do you even begin to check to see if their recurrent comments are true of you?
Well, we have to be practicing introspection if we're going to be, if we're sincere practitioners. We should be practicing introspection all the time anyway. So I think at times I have been cold and harsh and cruel. The thing is, I always believed that my motivations were coming from the deepest place. I too often trusted my gut feelings. And so after the crash of my community and during this period of deep introspection, I started thinking about a lot of things that had happened and thinking about things that I'd seen in myself and conclusions that I'd drawn. And I realized that sometimes things I was seeing, I was very objective, very clear, very passionate, very courageous. And some things were really more about me and my own ego's preferences. And I started seeing that much more clearly and then feeling ashamed about that and feeling, yeah, and I wish I'd known that earlier. But I had, because I wasn't willing to doubt myself, I was giving myself the benefit of the doubt too much of the time. And what does it feel like? It feels, well, it's not just humiliating. It was painful because if we're in a very powerful position and we're a little bit overconfident, that can have harsh consequences on other people's lives and other people's emotions and even sense of self-confidence and well-being.
One of the interesting issues in the book is the sort of interpretive flip that former students and former participants in your communities have undergone.
Yes.
Right? And that's a whole
cosmic
curriculum of its own to examine that kind of stuff. But also it's very familiar, I think, to a lot of people, because anyone who's been in a few serious relationships knows this weird of running into someone you used to be intimate with and realize they're telling or believing a story that you don't connect with at all. So that's a pretty common human experience. And I think it goes way back. Now, I know that you and Ken have talked about the role that green level participants might have played in, secretly building up resentments and looking for an explosion. But at the same time, ancient, maybe mythic, maybe pre-mythic tendencies in us to be believers. It's a kind of a vulnerability in a way. All right. So if you have people who are believing the thing you want them to believe, it seems okay. But you might not notice that they're being believers, and believers can switch to a new belief whenever the circumstance changes.
Well, I'd actually figured that. I figured that out. I realized that, especially powerful gurus, and this happens in religious contexts also, attract true believers. So a true believer is someone who has faith in the teaching, they have faith in the teacher, and they trust that the teacher is right and true and good, but they haven't yet individuated. They haven't become their own. They haven't tested the teaching themselves. They haven't become their own person yet. They're just true believers. And I think in the mythic past, being a true believer probably was enough to go and get all the way to kind of what a fully enlightened, whatever that actually means, I don't know, but whatever it could have meant, I think being a true believer at that time would have been enough. But in this day and age, unless we get, because I think the true believer is a phase we all go through if we're very moved and inspired and touched by spirit. But unless we actually individuate in the context of our own awakening, we're never going to get anywhere near being fully liberated, because we'll be blind. We'll be blind, and we're not going to be seeing so much of what's real. We'll be more attached to the feeling of security that the true believer feels.
So how does the teacher help the true believer to tease apart the part of themselves that's being, in a sense, willing from their ego, and the part of themselves that's been authentically drawn to the Dharma?
Well, the teacher has to bring up these distinctions and say, this is part of the path, and that's exactly where you're at. You're a true believer. And the love and the freedom you're experiencing is very fragile, because it's based upon a blind belief that's actually keeping you in prison. It's not setting you free. And I think, to be honest, Layman, it's something I see happening around me even now. And I speak about this, but it's hard. It's a very difficult thing to shake people out of, because if somebody loves you very deeply, and you give them a source of confidence in their own depth, in their own heart, people are afraid of questioning that and going to a deeper level of sovereignty in their own relationship to their own liberation. So speaking intellectually and philosophically and metaphysically about why that's a good idea and why it's essential to become truly liberated, becoming a sovereign soul, is an essential ingredient for all of us. And if we don't take that step, we're never going to be free. We're just going to be conditioned robots. Even if we have more acquainted with metaphysical feelings than other people, it's not going to have, we're not going to set our soul free. We're not going to be having the kind of wise intellects and liberated intuition that makes enlightenment actually meaningful and purposeful for all of us. But so I think what you're saying is true, and it's dangerous, and it's difficult, and it's a challenging part of being a charismatic leader in any context, for sure. But then there's the other side of the question that you brought up, which is the postmodern, integral or metamodern, sophisticated ego, which is never willing to really trust beyond the mind, which always knows better and is always afraid of being taken advantage of and brainwashed, is never willing to take the risk of not already knowing, which is the mysterious place from which the enlightened awareness actually emerges. So that would be the flip side of it, of being so cautious about being duped, which is which is a good idea, about being so cautious about being duped that one will never take that risk of letting the mind go even for a second. That's the problem.
A lot of human maturation is needed in order to handle both of those things, and on the part of both teachers and students, to create an ethos in which people can be simultaneously aware of the overly simplistic nature of their seemingly positive involvement in the teaching, yes, and aware of their equally naive and superficial tendency to reject, dismiss, and be trapped in suspicious recoil from all kinds of deeper engagement.
It's a tricky business. It's so tricky. It's tricky from every possible angle. It's very tricky.
There's the whole panorama of this book, let's say, is a beautiful thing. Right? The notion of the journey of a spiritual teacher to become a more complete human being is a very beautiful concept, I think. And I'm curious whether you think of that as an enhancement of the Dharma, like an increase in spirit's ability to access the world.
Yes.
Or is it just a different style that happens to be appropriate to contemporary cultural norms?
No, I think it's a huge addition, because the mythic belief that enlightenment means human perfection, that if enlightenment is going to be part of the evolution of culture itself, that needs to be a part of the picture. Because years ago, when I would bring my students to India to do long retreats, we would spend time in Bodh Gaya, spend time with a lot of the Tibetans and Tibetan teachers and their students. And we see that in India also with the Indian gurus also, that if there would ever be a question that whoever was considered to be enlightened, whether they were or not is another question, but whoever was collectively considered to be enlightened, has to be inherently seen as being perfect, because it's part of one belief system. And it's even true for most Westerners. Most Westerners assume that if enlightenment exists, and most people aren't sure that it does exist, but if it does, it has to mean human perfection. They say, no, it never meant human perfection. And it sounds ridiculously simple, but this is a very new concept. And I think so there it's very important that we individually and collectively learn to integrate this new information into our own spiritual aspirations. Because as I said before, we can experience perfection, which is what enlightened awareness is the experience of. We can experience perfection, but we can never be it. And that paradox is endlessly fascinating and infinitely compelling for me. I think it's essential if the Dharma is going to move forward in any meaningful way. I really do.
You and I talked before a little bit about Lee Lozowick, and you conducted one of the rare interviews with him not too long before his death. And in that interview, he talked about awakening being a bit like a birth, right? And after 10 years, you're kind of a 10-year-old. After 20 years, you're kind of a 20-year-old in your teaching and in your being as an enlightened being. So I'm curious how you might see all of this story as part of a natural maturing through growth phases of the awakening that you went through. Like, because we can tell a story where there was failure and collapse and an attempt to redress it somehow. But we can also tell a story where it's a natural phase of growth and expansion and maturation that the process itself is going through.
Well, I think the latter is the case, but I don't think, to be honest, I don't mean this to sound wrong, but I don't know of many other cases where a apparently realized teacher with a large following who's facing a big challenge in terms of dealing with their own karma, and it's actually let go for a period of time. I mean, really let go. I just never happened before. I've never heard of such a thing happening. So I think that this is, I don't think there's ever been there's been a situation quite like this before. So that's why I don't know how to answer the question. But I definitely know that it's enabled me to become much more fully human. There's no question about that. But I wish I could have done this in a much gentler way that would have caused much less grief to a lot of people.
If you could go back and give yourself some advice about how to do it in a more graceful, more efficient fashion, what would you say to yourself?
Well, there was a certain period, about 6 months before the community fell apart, when some of my closest friends made it clear that they needed to talk to me because they were unhappy and upset about some decisions I'd made and some choices I'd made. And my mythic identity felt very threatened because I'd never been questioned like that in the 25 or so years I'd been teaching. So I felt frightened and threatened, and in typical, kind of tragically typical, pathetic fashion, my pride before the fall, and I just became angry and felt betrayed instead of listening and opening up and realizing that they wanted to help all of us move to a higher level of integration and integral potential together. And I wasn't ready for it at the time. I wasn't mature enough in myself to be able to respond to it as much as I understood about integral theory, as much as we were speaking about it. I wasn't ready to engage at that level, and that was the main. That if I could go, what would change everything if I could go back to that moment, just meet with them in trust and love. I think our work together would have gone to another level, and it would have opened up in a very beautiful, natural way, which it needed to. Because one of the things that my friend Steve McIntosh said to me shortly after the crash of the community was, he said, well, Andrew, from a certain point of view, this shows what a good teacher you are, because when your senior students reached integral consciousness, the mythic guru paradigm wasn't going to work anymore. And they said, no, it can't go on like that. And that's part of what the truth is. So if I could go back to that moment and met them in trust, and met them in the kind of trust that I insisted that they always meet me in, I think my larger community would have continued to evolve and grow in beautiful ways that I could have never imagined. It would have been true for all of us. So that was my biggest mistake.
You mentioned, I think very aptly, that it's kind of impossible for you to judge whether this is a natural growth phase because we haven't seen these phases unfold like this in the past. So then there's a question of what is it that makes this a kind of new unfolding? And I'm curious what role you think integral consciousness or a different kind of dialogue, a different kind of language, the sort of new emergent framings that people are trying to work on, what role that had in allowing this circumstance to be different than a lot of previous circumstances through history with gurus and with the fall of communities?
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question. So as I'm answering, it's clear I didn't understand it. Forgive me. So I feel that, again, I don't know if this is answering your question, but I have felt, this is something I wanted to speak to you guys about in a few days, that I have felt that I have been surprised and disappointed that more people from the integral community have not been able to be more interested in the complexity of my own story and the complexity of my predicament and the predicament of my community through looking through the sophisticated prism of the integral lens. Because, for example, my good friend Diane Hamilton, who's been a huge friend to me throughout all this, I love her deeply. She said to me, Andrew, she said several times, look, she said, I've never met students like yours. I've never seen such incredibly sincere, dedicated, intelligent, sovereign individuals as practitioners. And she said, I always thought if any community could handle a challenge like this, it would have been yours. And so she was as amazed and dumbfounded that with all the training that my students had when we faced this challenge, that the community fell apart, within seconds or within a few months. So I think that there were a lot of different forces at work in this collapse collapsing process. And I've been disappointed that more people with integral consciousness were not interested in understanding this as a phenomenon that was happening within our ranks, because we had there was a lot of successes that we had in terms of working together as a group, working with an awakened teacher with a powerful teaching, which people were actually waking up, not only to being, but also to becoming, to the evolutionary context. And we were experimenting with this individually and collectively in ways that were revolutionary and inherently historically meaningful, I believe. And Ken Wilber definitely seemed to think so himself. That's one of the reasons he got so enthusiastic about my work. He was seeing the consequences of it and realizing how important it was. So I think there was so much good that we were doing, and seeing in the light of so much good that we were doing, and so much consciousness was being raised, there was still so much blindness, not only in me as a leader, but also in us collectively in terms of not being able to deal with this crisis. I think this is objectively something interesting to try and understand through using an integral lens, because it's pregnant with rich information for all of us. Because ultimately, we all want to come together in an idealistic framework. I mean, that's what we all really hope is possible. A lot of us are just cynical that we don't believe such a thing is ever possible, and we would never want to dare to even believe it is. So we say, well, that's too dangerous and stupid and idiotic. But people with an open heart are craving for ways for us to be able to come together in love and trust, so we can create paradise together, or at least try to create paradise, or if we're smart, an imperfect paradise. But that's a utopian aspiration, utopian ideal that we awaken to if we become more conscious. And as dangerous as it is, it's something that we all long for, to be together as one, the many wanting to come together as one. It's something that it's a bodhisattvic feeling, it's a bodhisattvic inspiration that if we awaken deeply enough, we'll feel ourselves longing to come together with others in idealistic hopefulness that's hopefully been sharpened and informed by integral theory and metamodern theory, so we can be smarter than people that have ever been who've tried to do the impossible. But that's what I feel we all long for, even people that haven't realized it yet, is to come together as one. It's very simple. And I think that is the deepest, most positive longing that we experience. So the fact that my story was seen as, just another one bites the dust, another corrupt guru kind of crashes and bites. The story wasn't that simple. It was much more rich and complex. And the fact that so few people seem to appreciate that, I found it disappointing.
Yeah, I think this is some stuff we'll get into in the next conversation.
Cool.
But there's fascinating elements to it. Like, one of the things that I think about is, as much as this looks like a failure to a lot of people, we don't know what we're comparing it against, right? This actually might have been the most successful possible outcome of a situation that would otherwise have been much worse. And that's one of the things I think about. The other one is, I certainly join you in wondering where, and trying to encourage a deep, integrally informed curiosity about the complexity of this situation.
Yes.
There's a disappointing tendency, at least in the superficial element of integral and metamodern communities, to really want to know and relate to and appreciate and use their advanced operating system to try to probe what's going on in these really interesting, really rich events that are pertinent to the existential future of human beings.
Exactly. I agree with you. And that's not what happened. So it just, because the thing was, what's been most humiliating to me, Layman, is I just became a cliche. I just became a cliche. And so I was like, so it made me very uncomfortable, and continues to make me uncomfortable, but the story's not over, so there's still much yet to unfold.
There's an interesting section in the book. It was interesting to me, where first you're talking about the flavor of the confrontational guru, both as being an expression of some things you saw in your own teacher, as an expression of some things that come out of your personality traits, but also as one of the classic forms of flavors of transmission in the world, to bring the radical challenge, right, to go to war against the ego, that kind of confrontational attitude. And so with that as the background, you then go into this notion that there's at least 3 different types of outcomes of bringing that confrontational mood to the ego of students and participants. And in the one case, the guru impulse was correct. The challenge was correct. It worked. The person underwent a transformation or a shift of some kind. The second case, maybe it was basically correct, and the means were imprecise and it created ambiguous effects. And in the third case, it was an expression of your own neurosis and needs, and you couldn't tell that apart from the guru function prompts. That's fascinating to have at least that level of discrimination among those effects. And I'm curious what you think would be the tip-offs for the things in the third category. Like, how would you go about discerning whether the prompt is coming out of the guru function or coming out of unconscious elements of the self structure?
Well, I think that the only solution to this is ongoingly working on ourselves and paying a lot more attention to where our impulses are coming from. So, for example, when I was a young teacher, I was teaching spontaneously at such a rate that I was almost like what was happening, especially at the beginning, was I was like hitting the bullseye again and again and again and again, and I couldn't believe how accurate my own intuition was being, and it led to a kind of blindness in assuming that I think I mentioned this before, that I was always on the money. So I think that even now, for example, I'm obviously I'm a much older man now, but so whenever we get older, hopefully we become a little bit more mature, a little bit more sensitive. But when I'm paying attention to my own emotional responses, especially with people that I love and people that I'm close to, I'm learning how to be much more, this doesn't sound very interesting, but I learned to be much more non-reactive, because I realize that a lot of the frustrations we feel with each other are often irrelevant. They don't really matter, and just leaving all the small stuff alone. As I get older, seems much more intelligent than making a big deal out of a small thing. So I'm having the experience now at this point in my life of feeling frustration and irritation with other people, but not acting on it and just bearing it, and then finding out either over time that it was either my own projection that had nothing to do with the other person, or finding out no, that what I was feeling was real and true, but the other person is just being their own imperfect self, and it doesn't really matter. So I think, because I wasn't scrutinizing my own inner experience in that way in those days, because I assumed that all my actions were coming from the purest motivation. So because I didn't know that anything other than that might be possible, I just wasn't going to notice it. But now there's much more likelihood that I would. Of course, there's no guarantees, because we're all works in progress. But I think there just has to be much more of a ground of humility in all of us all the time, and then never to be so overly confident about what our guts are telling us. We have to find a way to be paradoxically cautious, and also have the courage to be paradoxically be spontaneous and take huge risks in our relationships also. I mean, to respond in a slightly different way to what you just asked, Layman, I found from the very beginning that most people don't really want to be free, unconditionally free, whatever that means. Let's call it an aspiration. Whether it's attainable to be unconditionally free is probably unlikely, but as an aspiration, it's a noble aspiration. Very few people long to be unconditionally free. I always long to be unconditionally free. So, for example, a lot of people who are seeking for spiritual experiences and speaking for spiritual company, a lot of people, they like to be around powerful teachers and around powerful transmission and around Dharma that's uplifting. But they don't necessarily want to do the very challenging transformational work that we all have to do to come to terms with our less than perfect selves and our egoic or impure motivations. It's very difficult and very challenging. So sometimes someone like me, because I'm still a very serious teacher, sometimes you have to be forced to kind of challenge people, confront them with their own hypocrisy, with their own lack of sincerity. Because often people want to belong, and belonging is nice, and it's a wonderful thing to belong. But how much do we care about the thing itself that we're all working on here? And if we really care about the thing itself, we all have to be willing to find a way to be truly vulnerable and truly courageous with ourselves and with each other in ways that really is going to make something new emerge. And unless everybody's willing to pay that price, the spiritual work is going to end up being more about individual and collective affirmation, feeling good, than actually going somewhere new together and creating cracks in consciousness that will really reveal potentials that haven't been available to us yet. That's what I'm interested in, and that's what I've always been interested in. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Another thing that I found is that, to be brutally honest, I've thought a lot about this, but most of my students, those students of mine who did the best with the teachings and became really, strong, independent, sovereign souls within the context of what I was teaching, were people who generally were in better shape psychologically and emotionally, had stronger egos in the positive sense of what that means. So they could handle the challenge of awakening and take responsibility for themselves without falling apart. Whereas individuals who had less ego strength, often I realized in retrospect didn't have the wherewithal to withstand the challenge that I was offering people. So I think I'm trying to be much more careful now with who I'm working with and how I'm working with them, to be more sensitive to the actual, what I perceive as the different capacities people bring to me.
Yeah, a lot of variation in ego strength, and probably a lot of variation we've still to figure out around, like, the notion of consent. Consent is an interesting idea because postmodern culture sort of discovers its importance, but doesn't really know how to handle it responsibly. So it then needs to be migrated to a much more sophisticated plane of consciousness in order to be handled sensibly. Because there's a lot of, I think this is one of people's main anxieties around deeper, more challenging, more risky elements of spiritual life, is how is consent going to play out, right? And we've talked a little bit about how there's a positive and negative version of that, because you can contract around your ego's notion of having to give consent, but also we're not very good as human beings at appreciating the need for consent from others and their ability to give consent, because people can say yes, and it doesn't mean that all or even most of them is agreeing. So how do we, it's an unanswered question really, but how do you set up a situation in which where consent is more obvious and more required and more true of the whole of the person?
Well, the thing is, I was in a situation last night with a group of students, online students, and I was speaking about exactly this topic. And I knew that everybody was trying to respond positively with good spirit, because they respect me and they care about me. But I realized most of the people were nowhere near being in a position to be able to give that kind of consent. It was very far away. I think that this is a very sophisticated and very challenging question you're asking, because without that kind of consent in a real teacher-student or relationship with a real guru, without consent, there can't be any movement. And at the same time, how do we, in a postmodern or metamodern context, give that kind of consent without giving up our power? And I know it's possible, but this is the tricky part, because a lot of people think, well, it has to be blind trust, which is going to mean I have to give up my power. And I say, no, we can't do it that way anymore. As powerfully as that can work in the short term, it can't be an acceptable or reasonable expectation anymore, just because of the evolution of culture. So nobody's allowed to give up their power for any reason. We have to never give up our sovereignty, and at the same time find the wherewithal in ourselves to surrender unconditionally, which is a total paradox. And how to make that happen, I don't know, but I know that it needs to happen because it's an unanswerable question. So one of the things that Daniela brought to my attention, which has been very powerful for me, is we had about 2 years ago, we were in Paris, and I thought she was wrong about something. And she said, no, this is very important, Andrew. And I was kind of mocking her a little bit playfully. But it was about a decision that we needed to make. And I felt she was being a little bit too controlling and a little bit too worried about something that wasn't important. And I realized the next morning that actually she'd been completely right and I'd been completely wrong. And but she was beautiful, and I said, how did you get through that? She said, because I decided that I was going to trust you anyway. And her trusting my own heart, because she felt she knew I was a very trustworthy person that she cared about, made it possible for us to kind of get through that what could have been a thorny issue. It helped us to get through it together in a way that didn't create any karma. So I think that so what I learned from that is that trust is the keys to the kingdom in this context. But of course, we have to prove ourselves as being worthy of trust. We have to be trustworthy, and that's not an easy thing, especially when we're working with each other's souls. Proving our trustworthiness is a big deal. And I think that the only way to find out if someone's trustworthy is you have to get to know somebody over a period of years. Days, months, weeks is not enough. But if you know somebody long enough and you see them facing real challenges, you'll know what their values truly are and whether they're actually ultimately trustworthy or not.
Yeah, it does seem like the form of the teaching, the network of people involved in transmission has to maybe be a little smaller, a little more reliable, better vetted, more organic, less focused on sort of a mass scale public sell. And slower, a little bit slower. Like it takes time for people to grow trust together. They can't just show up in the ancient way and we've heard that it's good and then get on board and surrender.
No, absolutely not.
And yet there's an element of that ancient thing that can't be lost, right? We have to be capable of the same degree of the sacrificial gesture of trust, but it has to come in a way that's more organic and more embracing of skeptical intelligence that isn't in recoil.
Exactly, and the trust has to always be in a context of powerful sovereignty, because a lot of seekers don't want to embrace their own sovereignty; they want to be followers. And so that's why being involved with a kind of a charismatic leader can kind of relieve a lot of people of the burden of their responsibility for their own lives. And that's not doing anybody any good.
Here's a question I don't know the answer to, which is, do the people who come for different reasons have different functions in terms of the spread of spirit through the world? Like in an insect hive, not all the insects are specialized for the same function. Some of them might be sincerely trying to awaken. Other people might seemingly have come for some superficial reason, but in a bigger picture, they're serving the function a little bit. They're taking a little bit of the pollen and distributing it to some flowers. Like it's uncertain, like what's failure and what's a different function within the complex event of realization.
Well, I think that's a fair question. I struggle with a lot in the past. The $64,000 question. What's very difficult in this postmodern context is the whole issue of hierarchy. And this is it's a very, very thorny issue because spiritual development is not just horizontal as we know in terms of states, but it's also vertical. And some people are actually more spiritually developed than others. But the postmodern ego finds that very hard to accept. Because, so are you saying, how can you say, it's almost like someone saying, well, I'm more human than you are, which is something that we can't say. And the thing is that in the traditional era, there was this appreciation of spiritual hierarchy and the fact that some people were more developed than others in that unique context. But since consciousness is such an ultimate mystery, when we bring this mythic notion of verticality of hierarchy into a postmodern context where we're speaking about spirituality, a lot of people have a lot of trouble with it because people feel that it's a violation of the inherent perfection and sovereignty and inherent uniqueness of our humanity. When it means nothing of the sort, it's just saying that some people can be more deeply established in the evolution of consciousness than others, and that actually means something as a value in terms of the expression of their humanity. If you have the eyes to see it, you'll recognize it. Most people don't, but if you do, so how do we embrace this important distinction in a postmodern context in a way that doesn't offend people that honors the evolutionary nature of spirit, the evolutionary potential, the nature of spirit itself. And that's something I've been struggling with for a long time. So if one of the mistakes I made is I was using kind of a mythic context with my students. That was very, very crude, but there were different levels of people's development that I was trying to honor and bring attention to, because I feel that the more we can explicate the truth of these developmental differences, spirit is helping us to shine through all of us more powerfully, and just objective structures begin to appear that won't appear unless we acknowledge these different levels of development. So how to make room for this kind of emergent potential in collective consciousness while not offending the postmodern ego, and I don't know how to do that. But I know, especially in the kind of work that I was trying to do and am still trying to do, this is a really thorny issue.
Yeah, it looks to me like there's it's two versions of the same problem in a way, right? If there's an old method where the community is fallen and one person is perfect, then you have a certain problem. If you have a community where we're all perfect and that one person is fallen, it's a version of the same kind of problem. Similar dynamics are in play. It's just a negative version of the same phenomenon. So what's between those two? Like how do we get an embrace of the horizontal and an embrace of the vertical without either going to flat or having just a single totemic magical person at the top? It's a really interesting problem that more people should be standing in front of.
Well, I think the answer comes through a committed collective of individuals working together, vulnerably, with commitment, in an ongoing process, realizing that the process is one. If we're working with it seriously, it's going to be changing all the time. There's nothing static about it. And if everybody's being as transparent and as authentic and as genuine and sincere as they're humanly capable of being together, then I think these challenges will work themselves out, because people will be trusting, because the collective should then begin to trust what everybody's beginning to see, assuming people have eyes to see it. But I remember I met years ago with a great Tibetan Rinpoche named Chatra Rinpoche, who was considered to be a Buddha by his own people. And he told me that, he said, Andrew, he said, you could be sitting at a table with a living Buddha, but if nobody had the eyes to recognize him, they wouldn't know who they were with. So the problem when we're dealing with this is a whole issue of verticality in the way that you and I are speaking about it now. The individuals who are doing this kind of work have to be sufficiently developed to be able to recognize these differences. And unless most people can actually recognize them, it's not going to work. But that's already a very high level operating system that you would have to have there.
Yeah.
Because
one of the things is to start with people who have a high level of development. And also you've got to start with a lot of trust to begin with.
Exactly.
But the thing that's leaping out to me is the need for the right kind of communication between these people, so that they're making themselves available to each other, to those eyes that can see. Right? I think there's a lot of circumstances in which people are not even talking about the subtle and existential aspects of what they're going through, such that people could hear it and start to learn about vertical differences by understanding, rather than by assuming we're all the same or by believing someone who says they have more of something, right? If trusted people of high development could say more about their actual existential experience with each other, then I think we could get a better sense of what the vertical and horizontal contours of this space are.
Amen. That's very beautifully put. But it's such delicate territory, and I think because of modernity and postmodernity, so many of us are so experientially and theoretically unequipped to navigate this kind of territory. Even a traditional religious context would at least prepare us, making some of these kinds of distinctions.
One of the most exciting parts, maybe the climax of the book, is the ayahuasca experience.
Oh God.
It stands out to me because I'm an advocate for the reinvigoration of spirituality with shamanic nutrients, regardless of what the tradition is. And two things stood out to me from the way you related this section. One's very personal, one's very interpersonal. So maybe I'll ask about both. The personal one is that you had to realize the sheer pervasiveness of these childhood patterns that you were playing out. Right?
Yes.
This inner struggle between being either the bad boy who deserves to be punished or the all-perfect hero sort of drove these patterns of arrogance that manifested in ways, even ways that kept you from overcoming that very thing, that drove you into a kind of arrogance about your own failure and about your own trap that you were in. Yeah, I'm just so curious about it. I'm not even sure what the question is, because it seems like you had to realize how pervasively haunted by this pattern you were in order to.
Well, before that particular ayahuasca journey, I remember I asked the medicine, how did this happen? And she answered the question. She showed me the wounding that had created the sense of insufficiency as a young person, which is not a novel idea by any stretch of the imagination. But I witnessed it at an energetic level, and saw the paradox of that I was stuck in a trap, that I was either the bad boy and deserved to be punished, and I kind of realized that this whole mess, the whole situation, my shadow had somehow created it perfectly and executed it perfectly. And if I couldn't be the perfect Sadhguru, then I was going to be the bad boy that deserved to be punished. And the fact that at least in that state of consciousness from the plant medicine, seemed that my ego had executed this job so perfectly, it was simultaneously humiliating and also liberating, because I felt in that moment I joined the human race in a way that I'd never done before in my life, because it was so unbelievably clear. And I saw the tragedy for all of us, for all human beings who are trapped in these patterns. I saw there was something so impersonal and poignant about it. And I found it heartbreaking in a way that transcended my own personal condition. It was very liberating and empowering.
You know, the Gurdjieffians have this notion of the chief feature, of some recurring element that's binding the ego across all kinds of areas of your life that you can't see, but maybe other people can see who know you. And I'm curious, when you take the experience you've gone through and you think about the ego structure of other human beings, is it your sense that there's sort of a dominant motif that's holding people back in general from evolving in terms of their own human depth and complexity?
Well, I'm a kind of one-trick pony, Layman. So, from my point of view, which is very vast, but it's also very narrow, is that when we have an awakening experience, part of the awakening experience is realizing how lost in samsara and in our own personal, individual, and collective minds, that our consciousness is just totally trapped in and immersed in all the time. It's like waking up and realizing that there's a difference between samsara and nirvana, and we realize that most of the time we are living in samsara without even knowing it. So, as my guru told me, quoting the Buddha, he said, Andrew, as nirvana has no beginning and no end, samsara has no beginning and no end. So what I find as a reoccurring theme here is that most people don't realize how trapped they are in their individual minds and our collective minds. And I find that it's tragic and heartbreaking. I think as we begin to wake up from this trap, we begin to glimpse possibilities of a different kind of life and a different kind of possibility. And that's when we can really begin to talk and have a different kind of relationship that is based upon recognizing that freedom is attainable. But this is kind of a universal problem that people like the Buddha recognized thousands of years ago. And what I find endlessly fascinating and compelling is the eternal nature of samsara and nirvana as these self-contained worlds. And because, a lot of people say, well, the problem with enlightenment, people that are interested in enlightenment, is they're spiritual bypassers. And I say, well, that's true. But I think that's what the Buddha had in mind. That from a certain point of view, enlightenment is exactly about spiritual bypassing. It's about, from a certain absolute point of view, it's about bypassing samsara. And of course, now we want to be more sophisticated. We want a more sophisticated approach, because we want to include samsara but transcend it at the same time, which is easier said than done. But I think that samsara can be powerfully transcended very often in ways that literally will completely change our relationship to life in a way that literally changes everything. And I so much want people to know this, because the psychological solution of working mainly to have a well-integrated ego will make us happier, but it won't set us free. And I want people to understand that it is possible for us to experience a kind of dynamic, profound spiritual freedom that can and will change everything.
Yeah, the goal it's a very subtle and complex goal we're sort of starting to set for ourselves at the leading edge of the species, which is how do you spiritually bypass a more integrated ego rather than a less integrated ego?
The thing is, the more I've come to understand how this works as I get older, I think that we actually need a well-integrated ego, so that enlightened awareness can shine through it more powerfully. But it's the willingness to let go unconditionally of the ego's interpretive framework and value sphere, which is what changes everything. It's our conditioned ego. The collective ego has trapped us in a lot of values that may or may not be we may or may not choose in our freest or highest or most open moments. So what I like people to do is I want people to experience a profound degree of inner freedom and say, was that moment of consciousness the most important moment in your life? And then they'll say yes. I say, why? And then they'll explain why. So I say, if that's more important than anything else, don't you think our value should be based upon that as the starting point? And he says, yes. Because without that, I don't know how we can really create a new world together. Not radically.
The other thing that leapt out to me in the part of the book about the ayahuasca experience, and it was just a bit of phrasing, but it really seemed salient to me, was about appreciating other people's sense of betrayal, right?
Yes.
And it occurs to me that as human beings, we are in general not very good at that, right? In my own life, I've been terrible at it, and I'm not worse than most. There's a difficulty in taking seriously that other people feel betrayed, regardless of the objective condition. They may or may not have a reason. They may or may not be correct about why they feel betrayed. But the inability to take seriously and factor in the sense of betrayal in the other seems to me to be holding a lot of us back from getting to a deeper place. And it also seems to me to be the kind of typical failing of leaders in general and gurus as well, in terms that they can open to a lot of things, but actually taking seriously that the other person feels betrayed by something you've done, it's like kind of the last thing you can take seriously. How important is it to try to become sensitized to the confessions of betrayal from others?
Well, I think it's been the hardest and most emotionally gutting and challenging part of this journey for me, because Robert Masters is someone who helped me a great deal to kind of look into that and to face it. And it was excruciating, it was unbearable. It was some of the most, to realize that one has let other people down in the most important way challenges one's self-image in a way that's pretty dramatic. Whether one is being seen clearly and honestly by others or not, as you just said, is another issue. But I found that the most difficult part of this journey was facing into the sense of betrayal that so many people who held me in such high regard felt about me, unbearable. How important it is in terms of our overall growth and development, I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's a good question.
When I think about your life, one of the things that intrigues me is how you've continued to add things in. You've got this awakening story, but then it adds this notion of tactically struggling with people's egos. And then it adds an evolutionary framing, and it adds a collective framing, and it adds an integrative philosophy. And now it seems to have added a deeper understanding of how our minds and hearts protect themselves from unpleasant feedback in different aspects of our psyche. There's no question in there. It's just something I see when I read this book and when I interact with you is a very interesting story of like modules being added to classical enlightenment. And I think this new module that's hinted at by this book is one of the most important, both for bringing enlightenment forward in the emerging world and also for, well, this is kind of the same thing, allowing the kinds of people who are emerging and who might be the best people on the planet to receive the strong challenge and the important motivational shift associated with enlightenment and spirituality. I think there's a degree to which that can't happen unless we all get much better at understanding and having a conversation around the way our minds are, even when we're in our good modes, protecting ourselves from a lot of unpleasant feedback.
Indeed. Well, to walk the spiritual path in earnest requires an enormous amount of courage, vulnerability, transparency, and authenticity. And it's never ending. It never lets up. And the more authentic and the more truly genuine, authentic, transparent, and courageous we can be, if it's assuming it's for real, we can transmit to other people the fact that it's possible to be vulnerable and transparent and not be crushed by it, because it's almost like our own vulnerability and transparency and authenticity can become an invitation to others to join us. And if we can join each other in that kind of realness, and spirit is really coming forth through us in a way that's deeply transformative and incredibly liberating, life enhancing, and deeply empowering.
What does having completed this book free you up for? What's next?
Well, my aspirations haven't changed at all. I'm simply focused on, because I realize the only thing I care about is turning people onto consciousness, to spirit, to enlightened awareness, having them awaken, having them understand the glory and the magic of enlightened awareness, and then become interested in the culturally implicated potentials of collective consciousness, of intersubjective non-duality. Because when we can meet in that magical place, that magical space, it really feels like we can create the foundations for a profoundly different kind of future together. That's what it feels like. I realized recently that in these profound states of intersubjective non-duality, that people can experience this exhilarating future potentials can emerge through us, and nothing's more exhilarating than that when we feel the future awakening to itself in and through us collectively. It's very thrilling. But whether this heightened collective consciousness has the power to solve problems in a way a lot of people are hoping that it does, I haven't seen any evidence of that yet. So I think this is new territory, and I think that the future of where all this is going, at least initially, is really about meeting each other beyond their separateness and awakening to the power of this collective mind in ways that can show us a different possibility for our species. That's all. So to answer your question, it's the only thing I care about is teaching and helping people to realize these possibilities, and then do whatever we can to manifest them. I have no other interests, really. So, and what's possible is I want to try and heal some of the damage I myself have caused through bringing ridicule and shame and to the guru principle itself, because I know that meeting my own guru should change my life in 20 minutes, and I feel that the awakened realizer has a capacity to help other people to awaken in ways that can speed this process up dramatically. And my own teacher, while he had many problems of his own in terms of the imperfection of his own humanity, being in his metaphysical presence, changed my life in ways that I can't even begin to measure. I mean, I feel a state of eternal gratitude to him for what he gave me for free in 20 minutes. And he was not a perfect human being. but his soul was illuminated by the radiance of spirit in a way that was absolutely infectious, and I have never recovered from that meeting. So I hope that my reemergence as a teacher, hopefully as a better man, will renew some of the dignity and the preciousness of the Guru principle, which I feel is very important.
Do you think the Guru principle needs to have a positive reputation in the world, or might it be able to succeed as a dubious enterprise?
Well, I think that I'm living here in India now, and I think it's part of the culture here that higher consciousness and enlightened awareness, that this Guru principle is actually part and parcel of life, and people take it seriously. Even if they're not personally involved in it, they realize that these capacities actually exist. So I think that it doesn't help us to feel dubious about them, to be dubious and skeptical, to be able to honor and respect that the Guru principle is a function of nature itself. That once this principle gets awakened, people have a gift of awakening consciousness and sharing consciousness with other people. It's a gift that comes to us from nature, and then if we realize that's true, and I believe that it is true, we realize that this process was meant to happen. That consciousness seems to delight in its own self-recognition and wants us to wake up, and nature and this world process is giving us all the tools we need if we have the eyes to recognize it. Now, if that's really true, and I'm not imagining it, and I believe that it's true, that gives us enormous confidence in this mysterious process that we find ourselves in the midst of. It's very encouraging. And if that's not going to happen, then I guess it'll have to be clandestine, as you're saying, for the time being, because the culture at large just isn't ready for it.
I think I'm empty of questions. Is there anything else you want to bring up in this conversation before we come to a close?
No, I feel utterly blessed by your open-heartedness and your big-mindedness. I can't think of anything particular, but I feel very grateful for your interest in my work and your appreciation of it and your beautiful mind. I'm a student of, as I'll tell you when we meet next week, I'm also one of your students. You didn't know that. So I appreciate you, Layman, enormously because of your. It's not just because you're brilliant, but it's because of the depth and the complexity of your thought process. And I realize that you're able to consider more perspectives than most people I know in ways that are very open-hearted and generous, which helps us all to understand reality more clearly. And I feel you brought that to my work. So I feel very grateful and blessed. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
That's lovely to hear. I'll say again to people that I personally enjoyed this book very much, and that it touches a lot of questions that I spend time contemplating, and I think that we should, in general, be a lot more curious about. And on behalf of the unity of formlessness and evolving forms that I sort of am, thank you, Andrew. This has been beautiful.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much.
Hi. If you're anything like me, you probably sometimes want to know where my shirt is. Maybe that information was mentioned in a podcast somewhere, but how are you going to find it? Are you going to personally watch all the episodes of The Integral Stage and all the adjacent meta-community podcasts, hoping to stumble on the information? Don't be stupid. That's too long of time. How would you even know you're checking the right podcasts? Instead, go to the Apple App Store on the internet and get Fathom.fm. Fathom.fm is a meta podcast platform that not only figures out which podcasts you should be listening to, but which parts of those podcasts contain the answers to the questions you're interested in. Fathom.fm is making podcasts searchable, instantly chapterizable, and transcribable, and training up teams of suspiciously intelligent AIs to do the work for us. The digital universe is becoming curated by conversations and interfaced with through automated dialogue processes. So if you want to put yourself in the best position for digital synchronicity and distributed sense-making this year, you may have to submit to our Robot Masters. Ask your doctor if cyborg interfacing is right for you. Fathom.fm. I do it.